All right, we're ready to move into the question and answer section. And so I'm going to turn this over to Frank Ackland.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for the really interesting presentations today. I do have a list of questions, a few. I'll start out with the first ones first, which came to Vladimir. So Vladimir, I'd like to, here's I think got 4 questions for you, Vlad.
Mm-hmm.
Number one is this: can LAVs be influenced by solar activity, particles released, or by the Earth's geomagnetic field? What do you think?
Well, to my mind, hardly so. I would be very surprised if there would be any connection between such subtle events like solar activity or something. No, I don't think so.
Okay. Next question. Do you think that Ross's ECAT is stimulating LAV with pulses? If so, what frequency range do you think he is using?
That's a good question. Thank you. In principle, any triggering, any driving of the system from what we call thermal equilibrium, yeah? Well, the system is at thermal equilibrium. It's if it's at a constant temperature and nothing is happens to it. Okay, this is the worst situation for LIVs, let's say, because in this case they only can appear like by small fluctuations. But we can actually see this from the modeling. Because in the modeling, the most easy way to produce LIVs is to produce a thermal, for instance, a thermal gradient, which means a thermal spike. You just hit instantly a part of a sample and then let it relax. Yes, and due to this relaxation, interesting things occur. So-called long-waved phonons. They go away quickly. So the system is cooled down, but different frequencies, let's say, disappear at different spaces. So the long-waved disappear first. And in this case, the system becomes enriched in the short-waved phonons. And the short-waved phonons, they jump to each other, so interact with each other, and this gives rise to the LIVs. So, in principle, any kind of triggering is helpful. But I don't know which frequencies is used by Rossi. And according to the model, of course, the best things to do is to try to match the LIV frequencies as such. But we don't know yet what are these. For instance, from the experiment by Letts and Hagelstein, yeah, one could reduce some frequencies in the terahertz diapason from 8 to 20. But, okay, it's deuterated palladium. In Rossi case, we have nickel plus hydrogen, okay? Hydrogen is more light. So the hydrogen cell frequencies are expected to be high. But it's not only the mass, also the force constant should be taken into account. So what I mean is not possible to find the answer with my fingers or even with my pen. We need really modeling starting from the ab initio simulations, which takes time and significant efforts. But I think that if we do that, and actually we are doing that, we are trying to do that now, the reward would be the indication of this range of the frequencies which we are going to try technically. So far I know that the terahertz range is not very easily reached. There are terahertz generators, but usually they stop below 10 terahertz. And it can happen that the most interesting region is somewhere between 10 terahertz and 100 terahertz. And to my knowledge, they are not at the market, let's say, these sources of such kind. And now we are trying to not even construct, we are trying to understand how to construct these sources. And if we do, then we'll compare our results with Rossi. But to my mind, it's more promising way, because in this way you can reach really cold fusion or cold nuclear reactions, yeah, as the title goes, cold. And now people trying to rise temperature, somehow forgetting that the temperature is a tricky thing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vlad. Another question here from Alan Smith. Do you have any suggestions to a potential nickel particle size that might be important?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And again, the answer to it can only be given by modeling of the LIVs in the clusters of different sizes. So far, we tried palladium hydrogen clusters containing a few hundreds, actually 147 atoms of palladium and 130 something atoms of hydrogen. And already in this cluster, we can see the small strings of hydrogen, like 3 hydrogen atoms, or deuterium, because it's the same chemically, yeah, which in principle is enough to form the LIV. In this case, two atoms at the edges, like somehow are fixed between palladium atoms, and the central atom can start vibrating. But it's only one of the realization. Yeah. On one of the slides that I shown the work by Zhang with co-authors, they modeled a nano particle of nickel consisted out of approximately 2,000 of atoms, and having the size of 2 nanometers. And one can see that LIVs appear strictly along the grains and along these grain junctions, let's say, yeah? So from the intuitively, one can suggest that the the smaller the better, because when you make it smaller and smaller, you make more and more these cross sections, let's say, yes? And also from some modeling by Francesca Piazza in the colloidal protein clusters, there's an indication that in this seemingly disordered medium, you have some places, special places, with decreased barrier for LIV formation. So it's not only the question of the size, but also, let's say, topology of the system. So qualitatively, the answer can be given, but quantitatively, let's say, we need modeling.
Okay, thanks. Just one more question from Denis Laptev, who asks, what conditions should be satisfied to produce correlated coherent states?
Well, that's a very deep question, because up to now, we are mostly working with V theory, which I mean the theory by Vysotsky, who actually analyzed only one approximation. Approximation is that he considered the effect of the modulation of the width of a harmonic oscillator. Yeah, and this is a situation I also try to model. That's why I showed you three atoms. One in the center is really making big oscillations and be strongly localized, which means that neighbors are more or less in harmonic region. In this particular realization, from the V theory, it follows that the frequency of oscillation of the central one should be twice of the self-frequency of oscillation of the adjacent atoms. And by fitting the first constant, I managed to make the realization of this picture, and which at least qualitatively fits the experiment by Letz and Hagelstein. Yeah, it explains the three peaks observed. The lowest being the frequency of the self-frequency of the harmonic neighbors. The second one, the frequency of the middle one, twice, because it's 8 and 16. And finally, the highest one is the band edge of the phonon band, optical phonon band, from which actually the gap breather or gap LAV appears. So in this particular case, we can make some predictions. But on the other hand, actually with Denis Laptev, we now are trying to extend the theory to anharmonic region as well, and to see whether the realization of the so-called CCS here in correlated states, whether they can be realized in a really anharmonic case. So then we will know better. Now I think that I said enough.
Okay, well, thanks, Vlad. Okay, some more question. Here's one for Bob Grenier. This was about crowdfunding. How valuable do you think crowdfunding can be to fulfill the needs of the open source community? And
okay, can I first step back and answer some
yep. Go ahead.
Vladimir just talked about? When we had the pleasure of Piantelli's company, he told us of this story when he was a child, and he would go to visit this blacksmith, and the blacksmith, he wanted to learn, how he does his work and so on, and the blacksmith would get really, really annoyed and so on, and just give him something else to do, and he'd be warming this metal up, and he just thought, okay, I've had enough of this. So he says, can you just take that metal over there and quench it in that pool over there? And of course, he grabbed the end of the metal, no problem at all, goes over, dunks it into the water, and suddenly it's like, ah! And the reason is you get this shock wave of phonons that's nearly instant, like electricity. It just appears and burns your hand. So talking about the long waves that are created. Now, Piantelli has a rod for a reason. And you were talking about gradients being important. So DGT had a gradient. They had one temperature on one side of the reactor and one temperature on another. The exact design of Celani's cell is you have a mica support with a gap, and there's a large degree between the wire that's freely in the air and where it's contacting the mica support on every third turn. And then if you look at Piantelli, there's a gradient from one end to the other in his bars. So there's gradients everywhere, and once you set up the trigger, once you get the trigger going, so you've got to stoke the fire, you've got to set the fire, then that's the preparation, you've got to load it with hydrogen, and then you've got to trigger it. And then maybe if your environment is set up right, it will self-trigger, because if you have a 17 mega electron volt event over here, that is in itself a non-equilibrium state.
Yes.
So if you don't have your environment set up, it doesn't matter what you do. If it's not set up right to begin with, you won't be able to trigger it. And probably once you go past an environment where it won't be triggered, it doesn't matter what you do. You can take it to 1,000,000 degrees. It's not going to happen.
Oh, yes.
I think that's probably the kind of parameter space. And Piantelli talks, and he didn't tell us everything, but he talks about 13 parameter space. And one is like the size of the crystals, which, Domenko, it'd be great if you could model that. Then there's the temperature domains. Then there is the triggering domains. Then there is, and the triggering can also be by pressure change, but if you change the temperature quickly, that's a pressure change. Okay, so that's just related. There's a kind of visual story there, and there's the practical story to the kind of things that Vladimir was talking about. With regard to social fundraising, it's very successful up to the point that people think you've got enough money.
Yeah.
So whilst we have to thank the Bobcat Sweden, and can I just give you an understanding of the sacrifice that Bobcat Sweden is making? It is a private franchise. Every single person in that company is foregoing some of their bonus in order to provide some money to the MFMP.
Oh.
And I have met every single person in that company, and they've looked me in the eye, and I know I want to spend their money wisely.
Yeah.
But we're pretty much out of money at the moment. But I want to, with regard to the nickel 62 question, and possibly nickel 61, we'd like to support people like Brian with fundraising. We already have a small portion of this money raised to send him a salting of his reactor. Because I don't think it was clear in our presentation, but if you have a pure nickel 62 grain, and if it's important for whatever reason, and it's vapor deposited, so you've got a range of crystal sizes on the inside of your reactor, then it may be able to stimulate the high energy reactions if it's what Piantelli says, if it's what Rossi says. It is the mode of which it's operating. And those reactions will create a self-sustain that will breed the rest of the nickel you need, and then you reuse that. It's one approach, but we have to discount this. There's now too much in the record now to not at least try. And so if we're just needing to salt a reactor, it only needs a very small amount. I mean, you could double the nickel 62 in a reactor by just adding 3.6% of that 1 gram that we buy for 11,600. Okay? So you're talking about $450. It might sound a lot. And maybe this is why Rossi says, it's not so economical for desalinating water, because I have to start with a bunch of nickel 62, which costs me shitloads. Excuse me. Maybe he's found that it does breed its own fuel, so maybe the story's better now. But anyway, we need to run through this process, because yes, there's nickel 62. So yes, you could get some excess heat. Okay? There's 3.6% in there. But if it's important that you run it for a very long time, almost no one's been able to do that, because it is a challenging thing to do. And Brian will tell you it's really challenging. We've had one reactor, the Padua reactor, running for more than a week, nearly 2 weeks in total. But by the end of it, it was a wreck. So, it's a challenge. So if you need to breed your own nickel 62, and you're starting with naturally occurring nickel, where any crystals that are in there or any particles that are in there are a mishmash of 96.456% other nickel, then it may not work. So we need to answer this question. So I would like a social fundraising on this particular subject in the coming weeks. And like I say, we've got some of the money raised. If there are closed researchers that want to buy some, then they can apply. We'll have a questionnaire, as we've done in the past when we distributed some other materials. So if people are not open, they can still pay directly to have a proportion of that nickel 62. But for people like Brian, I would hope that we'd be able to raise the funds so that he can salt his reactors, and we can maybe answer this question with a few score of runs.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Bob. A question for Brian was dealing with, I'm trying to find it now. The question was about heating is generally being done on the outside. Have you thought about putting heating on the inside of the reactor, Brian?
Yeah, I actually tried that. I don't know if some of you may remember. We posted that on ECAT World at one time where I tried with a silicon nitride furnace igniter, tried heating on the inside that way, and it proved to be a disaster. It shorted out at, I think, around 400 or 500 C. So I have not returned to it since. ME356 had some interesting results when he tried his heater wire on the inside of the reactor. So I think it's something worth looking at again. I have not done it since the disaster that was the furnace igniter.
Okay. Am I missing any important questions? I mean, I've seen quite a bit of chit chat going on inside the chat box.
Can I answer that question as well?
Go ahead.
Yes, Me356 did do that, but if you think that the original Canon patent from a very long time ago, they had electrical stimulation within. There's the possibility to stimulate through or even heat directly through the sample rod in Piantelli's reactor. DGT were actually passing electricity and heat therefore through the center of the reactor. The latest Russian results are passing their energy through the center of the reactor. And obviously Chelani, he's passing it through the wire. And once he gets one result when it's passively heated, he gets a different result when the heat's going through, the electricity's going through the wire. This is all in line with what Dobenko was saying. So there's evidence out there to answer these questions. We do need to try more because Rossi had a heater in the middle of his first ECAS.
Okay. I'm going to turn this back over to Pat. I think we've got time for Alan, if you can think of that, Pat.
Oh, all right. Yes, I think we do have time. And so I need to find... Alan, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay.
And also I'm going to ask you to please start your video.
There we go.
Okay. Yes, so we'll give you a few moments and then Tom Wind will give us some closing remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much. I presume you can all see me because I'm hoping so. What I wanted to talk about was very cogent to the excellent speakers we've had today. Vladimir, a particular friend of mine, and did his usual wonderful job. He is, in my opinion, the man with the most sensible theory about LENR I've ever heard, and the most comprehensible at almost any level. But to move on, the whole problem of replication of the availability of materials, of demonstration systems, and so on, is one that's been occupying my mind for some time. I am an engineer who's kind of been forced to become a scientist over the years by various jobs I've had. Always kind of engineering at the edge of engineering somewhere or other, which I find the most interesting place to be. The purpose of my talking now, though, is that in a couple of weeks' time, I and a colleague called Sam Hansen are going to open a web shop which is dedicated to supplying systems and materials and know-how and whatever we can rustle up to LENR experimenters. It's going to be called Looking for Heat. This is not really public information yet, but I guess it is now. And we are planning to, it's not meant to be a huge profit center, but my feeling about the whole field is that it is very much in the situation, as far as amateur researchers go, of radio, back in the very early days of radio and television, when the largest contribution to the technology came from amateur researchers. Yeah, my own father was building Baird televisions and so on back in the 1920s, and he was very interested in that kind of a field, and as were many other people were. The principal method of collaboration then was through clubs and societies and magazines. those are no longer necessary because now we have the internet, which is possibly the greatest collaboration tool ever invented. So anyway, look out for it. Looking for Heat. It will be on the air in a couple of weeks' time. We hope to start at the beginning of December and have a whole broad range of systems. And we have secured an agreement with one of Vladimir's colleagues for a very robust and simple demonstrator, which seems to be very reliable as well, with the COP of about 1.2, a nickel hydrogen system. And we're going to be selling that as a kind of introduction to the whole field and as a practical starting point for people who want to do it, because it's the although 1.2 is not an exciting amount of excess heat, it is probably the simplest and most reliable system I've ever seen demonstrated, short of the ones we never get to see. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Many thanks, everyone. And what a great webinar. Really, really good. Thank you very much.
And thank you for that kind remark. Okay, let's go ahead and turn it over to Tom Wind for his closing remarks.
Well, I'm Tom Wind, President of Energy 2.0 Society. I want to thank our guest speakers, Vladimir, Brian, Bob, and I guess now Alan, for sharing their thoughts and ideas with us today on replicating the low-energy nuclear reactions. We admire them for their work and the efforts to advance this new technology. I also want to thank those of you who participated in our webinar today. I suspect you share the Energy 2.0 Society's enthusiasm and hope that this technology can provide an inexhaustible source of clean energy. We will be sending you a short survey asking for your candid comments on this webinar and on topics for future webinars hosted by Energy 2.0. We hope you'll just take a few minutes to participate in our survey. Today's webinar will be posted on our website. That's the purpose of our recording, and our website is energy2.0.org. Again, thanks for participating in this webinar, and this concludes our webinar. Goodbye.